Hello, and thank you again very much for coming along this evening. This evening we want to look again and continue our discussion of where do we turn to learn, especially on climate issues, but other environmental issues as well. We're in fact up against a kind of opposition to information in our culture from a lot of different sources. Some of it has to do with straightforward government censorship, but a lot of it has to do with, in effect, the way in which our media has evolved over the last several decades. And that's what we want to look at tonight, because it's not just a question of a few elections or a particular corporate influence on advertising or on purchasing of media outlets, but it's an assault on public information in general. And that's what we're going to look at, in effect. The assault on public information about climate plus climate, the environment, anything you really need to know as a citizen in a democracy to exercise your rights as a free voter. What kind of information are you getting? So we're looking at searching for truth in the internet age and the assault on public information about climate and other things. We've covered a number of themes in this general area in the past. Part one was on the war on science, searching for truth in the internet age, and focused particularly on the whistleblowing efforts of Joel Clement, who resigned because of the way his information was being ignored and, in effect, censored within the department, his scientific information. The second in the series was called The Government Attack on Climate Science, and looked more broadly at how the EPA, under its new director Scott Pruitt, and people like James Inhofe from the Senate have teamed up to, in effect, denigrate the contributions of both government scientists and scientists from the private sector who've been looking carefully at climate change for decades. And this last week we had a very important visit from Joel Clement, who emphasized in a public forum, in the Cambridge Forum, it doesn't really just hurt scientists, it hurts everybody. And it was a fantastic gathering. We had a great discussion with him and two other scientists, one who had been an administrator of the regional EPA for Region 1 in the Northeast, and a second one from the Union of Concerned Scientists, Andrew Rosenberg, who held forth not only from his experience there, but his experience earlier as an employee of NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. So they were looking particularly at the war against science from the government's end of things and its chilling effect. Further, just this past week, on November 14th, there was the sad announcement of Herman's death. Professor Herman, Edward Herman, was a media champion for years and years, and you should catch up with his work. He co-authored something with Noam Chomsky, which was very important, and in fact started the modern media discussions of these things. So we'll listen a bit to the news item that was given in tribute to him on Democracy Now!
Professor and media critic Edward Herman has died at the age of 92. He was author of many books, including Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media, which he co-authored with Noam Chomsky. This is a clip of Ed Herman appearing in the film The Brainwashing of My Dad.
The mainstream media are elite institutions. The ownership of the media is concentrated in the hands of very wealthy individuals. The media system is really a powerful set of structures. Most people don't have a choice. They don't have a spectrum of available choices that they can look at and say, oh, I like this or that. So you have a very limited, constrained set of options to begin with. So that's a bias that's built into the structure of the system.
Ed Herman died on Saturday at the age of 92.
Died on Saturday at the age of 92. This is a real loss for those who are interested in media matters, and in fact, for those who are interested in democracy, because as he points out, in effect, you don't have a choice unless you know about the choice. And he and Noam Chomsky have for years emphasized that the whole way to control and constrain public interest in anything is to confine the range of thinkable thought to a very narrow portion of the spectrum, right where the corporations want it, and can buy ads then to convince you that there's no problem or that theirs is the solution to whatever problem is being acknowledged. Now, as it turns out, this is happening at a time that the FCC is acting in very powerful ways to control the range of thinkable thought that you can possibly get hold of. It has opened the way for media companies to dominate, to buy up larger and larger shares of an audience. Sinclair Media, for example, has been, in effect, able to move forward by expanding its market share.
The Sinclair Broadcast Group, a conservative media juggernaut, is poised to own TV stations that would reach 72% of U.S. households. It's already the largest television owner-operator in the country, but now Sinclair looks to acquire the Chicago-based Tribune Media. And while the Federal Communications Commission has not yet signed off on the merger, it has paved the way for it with a series of new rules.
Well, when this story was broken on the 17th of November, they hadn't signed off on it yet. But listen what happened just later that day. It's pretty extraordinary.
Well, the Trump administration is also making its mark in media. Yesterday, the FCC, led by Trump appointee Ajit Pai, voted to repeal a 42-year-old rule regulating the way broadcast media companies can be bought and sold. Media. Yesterday, the FCC, led by Trump appointee Ajit Pai, voted to repeal a 42-year-old rule regulating the way broadcast media companies can be bought and sold. The original regulations were put in place to ensure a diversity of voices and opinions on air and in print. Pai said the rules were outdated in a digital age. NPR media correspondent David Folkenflik has thoughts. David, first explain more about what this 42-year-old rule said people couldn't do.
Well, so there are a couple of rules that are being swept away and a few more being proposed to be jettisoned. But one of the key ones was this one from the 70s, where it limits the ability of media companies to own a newspaper and a local TV station in the same company, market or region. And Ajit Pai said that this was, dusty thinking from a different age, earlier generations, that, with a welter of new conduits of information through Facebook and the web more generally, why we didn't need to worry so much about how many voices were dominating those particular areas. Having worked in smaller markets, I can tell you, if you only have 2 or 3 TV stations or 4 or 5 in town and 1 newspaper in town, it can matter who's producing all that news that you consume. And I think it's worth pointing out that, studies from the Pew Center and other places will tell you that even as there enormous number of new platforms in which you can consume information, newspapers and to some extent local TV really produce a great amount of the content that we consume. So people often mistake who owns the platform you're looking at thing with who's producing it, and those are often 2 very different outfits.
Right, so who stands to benefit? I mean, what might happen now that this goes through?
I think you're going to see even more media consolidation. It seems as though, you think of Comcast buying NBC Universal, think of Time Warner putting itself up for sale. That's not a competitors, but it's sort of complementary outfits. Well, is Verizon going to buy folks more? Are you going to see even more media outfits? Hearst has multiple outfits. You see the Murdoch empire. If you look at the 2 wings of it, 21st Century Fox, theoretically, Rupert Murdoch has had his eye on the LA Times for a very long time. Might he want to take a run at it?
Well, you can see what's happening here. The FCC, with a new Trump appointee, has just changed the rules in place for 40 years to try to keep markets independent of one another, and now they're allowing, in effect, something like 76% of American TV to be owned by one company. This is very, very worrisome, not just for information about climate science or environmental issues in general, but for any information getting out to the public on issues that concern them for their health, their safety, their welfare. All of these issues now are controlled by smaller and smaller groups or consortia of media owners and media producers. As he points out, it's not just who owns the media, but who is producing it for us to consume, as it were. But this comes along at a time when there's been a powerful new film by Jen Senko called The Brainwashing of My Dad, which has looked at the way in which that concentration of media has actually taken place over the last several decades because of a political movement in the country. The history's media really has to be looked into here, because this brainwashing didn't occur since last Tuesday or even the last election. It in fact has been an effort ever since the Nixon years. Take a look.
Decades ago, I was a junior hippie. My big brother was the real thing with hair down to his waist. I witnessed and felt part of the social revolution happening at that time, and I believed our country was going in a more open direction. Years later, when Reagan came in, I could feel the country was shifting to a more hardened place. And that's around the time my dad started to change.
Her dad started to change because of the 1960s defeat of the Nixon, in effect, approach to things. Now, Nixon was in power up through 72, but it was the conflict of the late 60s that led to the tensions that she explores in a very powerful film about her father and the brainwashing of her father. It starts with a piece on the 1960s, The Right is Pronounced Dead. Take a look.
Wouldn't have necessarily thought to go all the way back to the 60s, but author Claire Connor, who wrote Wrapped in the Flag, contacted me after she saw my trailer. Her personal experience with the John Birch Society helped put into place a major piece of the puzzle.
The John Birch Society came out of the McCarthy era and was built on this concept that the communist menace was right around the corner. Very quickly, the John Birch Society moved from those bad guys over in the Soviet Union, China, or in Cuba, to the idea that we had those bad guys right in our own government.
In 1964, Republican candidate Barry Goldwater had many Birch supporters. But this damaged him because, years earlier, word had leaked out that their founder, Robert Welch, had written a secret book branding sitting Republican president and World War II hero Dwight D. Eisenhower a communist. The Birches were labeled as nutty extremists. Goldwater and his platform were hammered by Lyndon Johnson. The right wing was declared dead. So they started to hit back. One of the most powerful ways was through creating their own media.
I first spotted David Brock in a documentary called The Hunting of the President. He had been a conservative operative involved in the organized effort of trying to take President Clinton down. But he came to regret it and wrote about what he learned from an insider's view. When I read his book, The Republican Noise Machine, I knew I had to talk to him. It took me a year and a half to get him, but I finally got to interview David Brock.
One of the very first things that the conservative movement did in trying to get control of the debate in the country was to do that through the media. And they established a couple of different organizations that market the notion of liberal media bias to the public. And so one of them is called Accuracy in Media by someone named Rita Irvine. They worked in the Nixon administration. And basically the idea behind this group was to counter their feeling that the media was opposed to Nixon's policies in Vietnam.
Certain that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
You could see how the campaign to discredit the media would lay the groundwork for a vast alternative media that would come later.
Well, that's it. there was a big effort to discredit the media because it was blamed, the media was blamed for the defeat in Vietnam and for Nixon's own impeachment, all liberal media, right? So linking up with the John Birch Society people from the 50s and 60s, the effort was to attack the media systematically. And the person who did it was Roger Ailes. From the 1970s on, meet Roger Ailes. Take a look. It's extraordinary.
One night I was watching Bill Moyers on Channel 13, and I learned about the role of Roger Ailes.
And I went back to the Nixon administration, and Roger Ailes was who's the chairman of Fox News, was in the Nixon administration. He was Nixon's television advisor. Absolutely.
Then I found Gabriel Sherman. He was the guy to talk to about Roger Ailes, for sure.
Roger Ailes understood that TV is about one thing. It's about emotion. And you need to communicate to the audience and hook into them on an emotional level. And Richard Nixon, who by all accounts was a very smart, a brilliant man who had a command of the issues, he couldn't connect with the audience. You know, he came off as stiff, as shifty-eyed, as famously in the 1960 presidential debate against John Kennedy, he was sweating. It was a terrible performance. Then he meets Roger Ailes in 1968. At the time, Roger Ailes was a young producer, the wonderkind of television at the age of 26. And so Roger Ailes coached Richard Nixon on how to communicate those ideas to the average American who was watching television every night at dinner table. Richard Nixon, whose political career almost blew up because of television, was able to win the presidency because he mastered it. At the time, in the late 1960s, TV had finally become a mass medium, and yet there really weren't people who had decoded the medium. Roger Ailes told Nixon that to appeal to the audience, he needed to use short, snappy one-liners that can stick in the audience's mind.
A great philosophy is never one without defeat. It is always one without fear.
And so really, Roger Ailes was a pioneer in the whole art of the soundbite. He told Nixon that America is dumb. So give them something simple, boil it down, and they'll get it.
Ailes was so involved with advising the administration, he even outlined Nixon's role in the lighting of the White House Christmas tree. But his designs for the GOP went much deeper. Ailes was outlining a way to avoid, quote, the censorship, the priorities, and the prejudices of network news selectors and disseminators. Written in 1970, this memo talks about how television had become the most powerful news source because people are lazy and want their thinking done for them. It became the blueprint for Fox News, and although its authorship is unclear, Roger Ailes' handwritten notes are seen throughout the document.
There are simple things that the American people believe in. It's the reason John Wayne is still one of the top 5 movie stars of all time. He's been dead for 40 years. But you always knew about him. Don't touch my woman, don't steal my horse, and don't ever draw a gun on me. Otherwise, we're going to get along fine.
It offers you a little action.
Roger Ailes was fired from the White House for seeming like he could go too rogue. Basically, he was caught talking behind Richard Nixon's back to author Joe McInnes. After that, Ailes started working for TVN, a television news network owned by the Coors family.
Their goal was to be like a tugboat to the Queen Mary. They were just going to be going along and pushing the boat a little further to the right and a little further to the right. And their goal was ultimately to put the great ship over as far right as they could. And Ailes was working for them at the time, and he didn't know much about news. I'm not even sure I know that he knows much about news now, but he sure does know television, and he's as good as television as anyone in the country, and he's a great propagandist.
By the way, the motto they came up with was fair and balanced.
Right, fair and balanced, and we know what that's led to, right? Well, among other things, it was coupled with the politics of division that Nixon mastered. Take a look.
The brilliance of Nixon was to bend a politics that was based on deference to money and plutocracy and frame it in terms of a kind of cultural populism. The idea that the real snobs are not the people who hire and fire, but the people who kind of decide cultural trends.
When Nixon was running for president, he had a problem. In 1964, Goldwater lost. Conservative was a dirty word. Everybody wanted to be a liberal. Nixon comes along in 67 and he says, we got to get working people to vote for Nixon. How do we do this?
Between 1964 and 67, the anti-war movement felt like a betrayal to many veterans who saw it as unpatriotic. Nixon seized on this and was openly hostile to the protesters. At the same time, women were pushing the boundaries of societal norms, which dictated they stay at home, raise children, and dress like ladies. Nixon came out for traditional family values, thus capturing the vote of the working men who felt threatened and didn't like what they saw as radical feminism. 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. Nixon capitalized on both racist and economic fears of whites and ran against school busing and for law and order.
Well, you can get the sense of it, and Chomsky's summary of it is very interesting.
The Republicans could change the party labels in the South by appealing to the racism and the strong opposition to the civil rights legislation and making that their stand.
In the spring of 1970, after Nixon orders the invasion of Cambodia, which was the instigation for the same protests at Kent State University that led to the deaths of the 4 students, one of the protests was at Federal Hall in Lower Manhattan. And right in the middle of this anti-war rally, this almost marauding army of construction workers came marching in their hard hats and started beating the protesters with their hard hats. It was all captured on film. It was on the evening news. Rather than excoriating these basically vigilantes, Richard Nixon invites the head of construction trades in New York, Peter Brennan, and Peter Brennan presents the commander-in-chief with a ceremonial hard hat. So he's almost kind of throwing his lot with the people who are beating the protesters.
Okay, now this is what happened in 72 then, in terms of the electoral reversal. Well, we ought to keep an eye on this, because this is what's behind the anti-press, anti-intellectual efforts. We can expose various deniers of climate change, and it's certainly true that the Koch brothers have been funding that ever since with disinformation and the like, but there's also a pathological refusal to look at the lying from the president himself at this point. We need a new kind of citizen science alliance.